Please welcome George Sarris.
Thank you. Well, it is a delight for sure to be able to be here. I used to be actually part of the New Canaan Society when it was in Jim Lane's house many, many years ago. How many of you were actually there at Jim Lane's house? Yeah. That's where it was. And went to a number of the NCS retreats at Mohonk Mountain House and down in Washington as well. So it's really been a delight to be able to come here. And I thank Paul especially for inviting me. Thank you so much. I'm really honored. It was truly an honor to be able to be invited to come here. I wanted to start by asking you a question, actually a couple of questions. The first question is, how much are you worth? How much are you worth? Now, I don't mean that in a financial sense. I mean that, how much are you worth as a person? How much are you worth to those who love you? How much are you worth to God who created you? Second question, very similar to that, is I want you to think of some people that you like, some people that you love, some people that are important to you. Maybe your wife, your children, your parents, close friends. How much are they worth? How much are they worth to you? How much are they worth to other people who love them? And how much are they worth to God who created them? Now the third question is, I want you to think of some people you don't like. People that may have values and ideas that are offensive to you. Maybe somebody that's actually offended you at some point in the past. How much are they worth? How much are they worth to those who love them? Because everybody's loved by somebody. How much are they worth to God who created them? I mention that because the answer to those questions is vital to understanding my book and my faith journey, which Paul asked me to share about. My faith journey actually began before I was born. My mom had a problem. It was my dad. It was not that kind of problem. They actually had a very good relationship together. But the problem was that my father was not able to have children. At least that's what the doctor told him. I don't know exactly what the details were. I just remember as a kid, my father said, yes, the doctor told me I had mumps and they went down. Whatever that meant, I have no idea. But he wasn't supposed to have children. Well, that was compounded as a problem for my mom because she was part of an immigrant family. And there were relatives and friends that thought that it was very, very important for them to let my mother know that she was cursed by God because she couldn't have kids. She poured her heart out one day to a friend who said, you know what you ought to do is go down to this church and you ought to take out something called a novena. A novena is something relating to the number 9. And so for 9 weeks, my mom went down once a week to this church and prayed that God would give her the ability to conceive and have a child. At the end of that time, she conceived and she went back 9 more weeks, once a week, to thank God for enabling her to conceive. And then after that, after I was born, she went back 9 more weeks to thank God for giving her a healthy baby boy. My brother was born 18 months later. And the reason I shared that is because I'm convinced God wanted me to be born. And I'm convinced God wanted my brother to be born. And I'm convinced God wanted each one of you to be born. And every single person that has ever lived on the face of this earth, I'm convinced God wanted them to be born. Doesn't make any difference who, when, where, how they were born. God wanted them to be born. They're important to God. You're important to God. 2 lessons that I learned from my parents as I grew up. One was that they loved me no matter what. I remember my dad used to say to my brother and I said, Georgie, Brian, how much do I love you? We'd say, how much? And think about it for a second and say, all the way up to the sky and back again. 500 zillion, 834 million, 656,432 times and more. The number always changed. But the point was that that my Father's love for my brother and I, as far as we were concerned, was more than the greatest distance we could ever conceive of, all the way up to the sky and back again, and greater than the biggest number we had ever heard. My Father loved us unconditionally. Second lesson my parents taught me was they didn't have favorites. I always knew that my dad would do whatever was necessary, and my mom as well, for my brother and I. We didn't always do what they wanted us to do, but I knew that they'd never reject me, and I knew they'd never reject my brother. I used to say to my mom periodically, you always did love Brian more than me. And she'd say, don't say that, Georgie, don't say that. The only reason I could say that was because we both knew it wasn't true. I knew that my mom loved me and my brother with the same quality of love. They didn't have favorites. Well, not all Greeks are philosophers and own restaurants, but my family did. My dad was always willing, as a philosopher, to share his thoughts on anything: politics, religion, life. In fact, he'd even share his thoughts on things he'd never thought about before. I admired my dad, but I was not like that. I didn't have strong opinions about anything. And as I grew up in high school, I was increasingly insecure about stating what I really believed. I thought that was not a good idea because I didn't really have clear understanding of what I did believe. Life to me was like a jigsaw puzzle. You had all these different pieces together, but how did they fit together? I didn't see a picture. There was no picture there for me to put the pieces together. Was God a Santa Claus? That he would give you good things if you were nice, but not if you were naughty? Was he a divine watchmaker? Started something out and then just let it run? Was he Aladdin's genie? Awesome power in a tiny little living space, right? Just rub the lamp in the right way and you get whatever it is that you want. I didn't know. I would pray. I had no idea of how God would answer, and he often didn't answer what I wanted to pray for. Well, then as a junior in college, I was invited to a prayer meeting by a young woman who told me she was a Christian. I thought that was absolutely amazing. I would never tell anybody that I was a Christian. I had made a profession of faith at some point when I was younger. I knew that if I died, I'd go to heaven, if God was really there, and I wasn't sure that God really was there. But if he were, I knew that I did the right thing at some point in my life, so therefore I'd go to heaven. But I wasn't going to tell anybody else that. I often say that I was a Secret Service Christian. I knew I was a Christian, God knew I was a Christian, and nobody else knew that. But this young woman said it publicly that she was a Christian and invited me to a prayer meeting. I was going to say no, and all of a sudden I heard my mouth say yes. She was attractive, so I thought that was a good thing to do. And went to the prayer meeting, and a young man came over and invited me to come over the next night for popcorn, and he shared something with me that transformed my life. The puzzle picture suddenly came into view, and I began to see where things fit into place, and the key puzzle piece was God. What I realized is that the reason I didn't get answers to prayer was because I wasn't the boss. God was the boss. God wanted me to follow his directions, and as I fit into his plan for my life, then God would provide the things that he wanted me to have to accomplish the purposes that he had for me. God was the center puzzle piece of the picture of life. And I saw that I would have significance as I fit into God's plan for my life. God was great. He was good. Like my parents, he was not just interested in me. He loved everyone, and he didn't have favorites. I graduated from college and went to work for a radio station in upstate New York. The radio station was owned by a man who was openly immoral. And I had recently become a Christian, and I was not very wise in terms of how I talked. And I would rebuke him periodically, or not necessarily rebuke him, but I would say things to him that were challenging his lifestyle. And he said to me one time, he said, George, you better be very careful because you may find yourself without a job. And I looked back at him and I said, something, Walter, I'm not afraid of that. my life is in God's hands. And if God allows me to be fired, it's because he has something better in mind for me. I got married in March of 1971, and in May, I'm sitting at my radio station microphone, and another announcer comes in and informs me that the radio station has had some financial difficulties. They have to get rid of one announcer, and George, you're the one that's going to get canned. I was devastated. I'd just gotten married 3 months earlier. My wife came up to the station that day, and I said, Susan, you got to sit down because I just got some really, really bad news. And I told her what happened. She looked up at me and she said, wow, that's exciting. I wonder what God has in store for us now. I'm very grateful for my wife, let me tell you. And I said off the cuff, you know, sweetheart, I had sent a letter to Campus Crusade for Christ a couple of months earlier, never gotten an answer. Maybe we'll go home today, we'll open up the mail, and we'll get a letter from Crusade asking us to come. Went home, opened up the mailbox, there's this letter from Campus Crusade for Christ. George, we need you to come out. We are looking for someone that has your skill set, and could you come in June for staff training and then go on? And I was excited. Next day I went up to the station. Walter came over and said, well, George, you got a job yet? I was dumbfounded. I looked up at him and I said, well, as a matter of fact, I do. And I told him what happened, asked him if I could stay on for 2 additional weeks so that it would coincide with when we had to go to California, and he said that would be fine. The fascinating thing is, however, if I had gotten that letter before I was fired, I probably would have said no, because I didn't want to raise support. I was afraid to do that. I had no understanding of what that was even all about. But because God allowed me to be fired, that gave me the freedom to accept this offer with Campus Crusade, which turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened in my life. My wife and I went out to Crusade in California at their headquarters. I worked in the radio, TV, film ministry, and we had a number of young people that had, our marriage flourished, our faith flourished. It was a great place for us to grow. But that never would have happened had God not allowed me to be fired. Let me just encourage some of you. If you're in a position where you've either lost your position or some other difficulties, don't worry about it. God has you in mind. He will provide for you in the way he wants you to be provided for. When I was in California, I was sitting down one day, and my mind went back to a time when I was in high school. My high school was a small school. We didn't have a wrestling team till my junior year in high school. And I went out for wrestling in my senior year. Well, what that meant was I was less experienced than the people I was going to be wrestling against. And I had some other difficulties. I was not good enough to make the grade in my particular weight class, so I couldn't fight in the weight class I was supposed to be in. But the man in the weight class above me always had difficulty getting down to the proper weight level, so they would throw me into the match in his place. So what that meant practically was I'd go out against someone who was more experienced than I was, bigger than I was, and stronger than I was, and I knew I was going to lose. And so not too long after the match started, I'd be on my back fighting to prevent being pinned, and a thought would go through my mind. The thought was, George, why don't you give up? You're going to lose anyway. And I'm ashamed to say it, but that's exactly what I did. I'd make this little dramatic, and then I'd give up. If I hadn't given up, I may have lost the match, but not necessarily by a pin. And even if I did get pinned legitimately, it wouldn't have been the kind of a thing where I would have felt bad inside. And I remembered that when I was in California. My mind went back to that event, and I said, oh, God, please, whatever happens, don't let me give up in life until I'm genuinely defeated. If I'm genuinely defeated, then you give up. But until then, don't let me give up in life until I'm genuinely defeated. I left Campus Crusade in 1975 to go to Gordon Conwell Seminary. But a problem existed in my mind. As I had begun to get to know God more and more, and the puzzle pieces of that jigsaw puzzle were starting to fit into place, the one piece that didn't fit into place, at least one of the pieces, was a question of hell. Was God a loser? Did an all-powerful, all-wise, all-loving God create a universe where the vast majority of the people he created and supposedly loved would suffer consciously forever? Was the creation that God said was very good in the beginning, would it end up almost very good, or even worse, would it end up very bad at the end, where most of those that he created suddenly were suffering consciously? Did Jesus fail in his mission to seek and save the lost? Would most of the lost never be found? Was sin more powerful than love? Was sin strong enough to cause God, who is love, to forsake those that he loved? Was darkness more powerful than light? On a level playing field, was evil more powerful than good? Those are questions that bothered me. And so I went to seminary, and in my last semester, I decided to take that issue as a topic for a research paper. And everyone I had talked to, every book that I had read up to that point, had always said that hell was conscious punishment that lasted forever. Until I got this one book. I think it must have been the only book in the library. I had gone through all kinds of books and trying to find out if somebody might have something that said there was a different idea. A book that was written by a man named Edward Beecher. Edward Beecher was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe. He was pastor of Park Street Church, if any of you know of Park Street Church up in Boston, for a number of years in the early 1800s. And he wrote a book called History of Opinions on the Scriptural Doctrine of Retribution. He published it in 1878, exactly 100 years prior to when I was working on my research paper. And what he said shocked me. I had never heard this before, and most of the professors that I talked to afterward had never heard it either. Because you got to remember, in the evangelical world, we start with the apostles, we jump 15 centuries to the reformers, and then we jump to people like Tim Keller and John Piper, people that are modern people today. We don't read about what happened in the interim. And he was pointing out that in the early church, the dominant view, the majority view, was that at the end of time, God was going to restore all of creation. That hell was real, but it had a positive purpose, and it didn't last forever. I was shocked. I had never heard that before. I wrote my paper, and I found out, by the way, that there were a number of scriptural ideas that fit into that as well. These were written by some godly people. Got an A- on my paper. I was really excited. I shared it with the professors at the seminary. I shared it with some other people, and they all kind of said to me, well, George, good try. Bottom line is, you're a student. You don't really understand that over time, the church has come to realize that that view was incorrect. That is not the correct view. So I decided to hold that as a private hope for many years, that there was room within Scripture for a belief that God would ultimately restore all of creation. Left campus, or left seminary, and God had, when I was a kid, I always wanted to be two things. People would say, what do you want to be when you grow up, George? I want to be an actor or a missionary. I don't know how those ever fit together, but that was what I wanted to be when I was a kid, either an actor or a missionary. And it turns out that God enabled me to be both, which was kind of fascinating. I did commercials, industrial films, trade show spokesman in the Boston area in New York. I was a spokesman for the ABC affiliate in Boston for 3.5 years, on the board of directors for Screen Actors Guild in Boston for 6 years. I developed a one-man show of Bible stories. You can actually see some of those on YouTube. I was a consultant for the Bowery Mission in New York for 6 years. Worked with a ministry to media professionals in New York for 10 years. And I narrated the NIV Bible for Zondervan, the entire Bible, which you can see on BibleGateway.com. You can actually hear it, by the way. You can hear me read any section of Scripture that you want. You just go to John chapter 3, verse 16. You can find it. If you want to go to Zephaniah chapter 2, you can go to there as well, and you'll hear me read the Bible. So I can actually prove to people I've actually read the Bible. One of my most recent things was a commercial for Puffs Plus Lotion. It starts out, it's called Dakota's Dragon. Little Dakota's nose was quivering in fear because she thought an ordinary tissue was near. The tissue made her nose sore and red, but Dad slayed the problem with Puffs Plus lotion instead. Anyway, it's a beautiful little commercial, animated commercial that was on for quite a long time over the fall and winter season this year. What that did, though, but as I began to enter into, I was a voiceover spokesman and on camera as well in the earlier years in the Boston area. What it did was it enabled my belief that God would ultimately restore all, gave me the freedom to love people for who they were, genuinely love them for who they were without an agenda, because I knew that God will ultimately be the victor. God is ultimately going to get them into his kingdom. I was able to focus on building relationships, not simply on winning arguments. I remember talking with Janice, Jewish woman, lovely woman. She was living with a guy for a number of years. I talked with her about that, not pushing too hard, but just mentioning that was not a good idea. I was one of the first people she called to tell me that she was going to get married to the guy she had been living with. On one occasion, I used to send out a Christmas card every year to the people on my mailing list of people I worked with, and one year I decided to share my personal testimony. And so I thought I ought to call her up because I didn't want it to be offensive. So I called Janice and I said, Janice, could you just look this over and tell me what you think? And I talked about the person who was born in the manger 2,000 years ago that transformed my life. And she said, George, I'm amazed that you would be willing to open your life up like that. Yeah, I'm not offended by that at all. Please send it to me. She's been very interested in my life ever since. There's a guy named Tom. Tom was a gay man back in the early 80s when it was not popular to be gay. I had a number of conversations with him about faith issues. On one occasion, I turned down some work. He had recommended me to a company to be a spokesman, and I said no because of something that would cause me to violate one of my principles. And he called me up after. He said, George, tell me again why you won't do that job. And I explained to him. He said, wow, I knew your faith was strong, but I didn't think it was that strong. Opportunity to minister to him. Several other people. 29 years after I wrote my paper, I decided that I needed to look deeper into it. I decided to rewrite my paper because it was a research paper, right? I'd given it out to a few people over the years, but I was quiet. I didn't want to tell too many people what would happen. And that was in 2007, and I decided to do some more research. The more research I did, the more convinced I was that what Edward Beecher had mentioned about the early church was true. And I got excited. I began to write, and instead of just revising my paper, it ended up turning into a book. My friends were often intrigued, but they said, George, it needs to be more readable. So I rewrote it. I sent it to the professor that I had known, who had originally written my paper for, who had become a very close friend. He read it and said, George, you got to get primary documents. And so I rewrote the paper, or the book. I contacted publishers. They weren't interested. The Christian publishers said, this is going to alienate our constituency, and it's going to alienate our other authors. We're not interested. Secular publishers said, George, who? I needed a platform, so I decided to write a blog and let people know a little bit about what was going on. And that was when everything hit the fan. As Paul mentioned, I sent a copy of the manuscript to the man who was in charge of the media ministry I'd been a part of for 10 years. And within 3 days later, I was terminated for doctrinal aberrations. A friend at the church we had been actively a part of, I had actually been an elder in that church. For 20 years, we had been actively involved in it. This one friend heard about what I wrote a letter to the elders and said, how can George possibly continue to be a member of this church when he doesn't believe what the doctrinal statement says? And so I met with the head elder at the time, close friend. We talked about it. He wanted to know exactly what my book was all about, which I told him. And we decided that it would be best if I would just quietly leave the church with my wife. We were part of a couples Bible study that we were asked not to attend anymore. A ministry to international students. We used to go down to the University of Bridgeport at least once a month and minister. It was a wonderful ministry to a lot of Chinese, Indian, even Iranian and Muslim students. Great opportunity to minister. I was asked not to continue there. One of my very closest friends for a long time, we used to have wonderful conversations about God. And I went to a conference one time, and he came up to me and he said, George, I don't want to be your friend anymore. What you have written is clearly you are a false teacher, and you are a wolf in sheep's clothing. And I even contacted the person who was in charge of this ministry to let them know that you should not have been allowed to come here and perform. And fortunately, I'd already told the person in charge of that ministry, so it didn't have a problem. I was not able to continue to perform. I mean, I was a performer, right? I have this one-man show, and I can't perform that at churches because they don't want me to come. I couldn't perform it at Christian conventions because they didn't want me to come. Couldn't perform it at conferences because the people didn't want me to come. I lost money, I lost position, I lost family, friends, I lost a church family as well. But I still didn't even have a publisher. And I'm thinking, man, I don't even have a publisher yet. I got this book. Nobody's read my book because it's not been published yet. And then out of the blue, in 2012, 42 years after I graduated from college, I got a phone call from one of my roommates in college, and on my birthday. We ended up talking for a couple of hours, and it turns out he was a marketing director for a couple of major companies. And at the end, he said, George, anything I can do to help you? And I said, well, I'm thinking about possibly self-publishing my book. Would you be willing to help me with a marketing plan? He said, oh, sure. Send me a copy of your book. I sent him a copy of the manuscript. He got back to me and said, George, this is a great extended research paper. It's not a book. You got to start each chapter with a story. You got to cut down on the volume of information in the text. And instead of using footnotes, you need to use endnotes so that it doesn't stop the flow. I followed his advice. He got excited. We ended up contacting a number of other publishers. And in the end, I was turned down by 28 publishers. And I turned down 2. I was at least encouraged that I was able to turn down 2 because they wanted too much control over the content. And I said, no, you can't do that. And then in March of this year, I published Heaven's Doors, 39 years after I wrote my paper, 10 years after I started the book. Within 2 weeks, it was flagged as the #1 new release in Christian Bible history and culture on Amazon. And it currently has 24 customer reviews. All of them are 5-star, including Paul Mahalski. So I'm very grateful. Just very quickly, because I got 3 minutes left. A couple of clarifications about my book, if you're interested at all. Is the book biblical? Yes. I am committed and have been all my life, all my adult life, to scriptural inerrancy. I believe the Bible is inerrant. And so if I'm going to teach something about God or whatever, it's got to come from the Bible. I'm convinced the Bible is absolutely true. Does the book teach that hell does not exist? No. Hell does exist, but for a good purpose, and it doesn't last forever. Does the book teach cheap grace? No. Because hell is not endless doesn't mean that it's not real. Hell is severe and intense for those who resist the grace of God. Does the book teach that hell is really purgatory, where works of penance are a substitute for the work of Christ? No. It's only because of the cross of Christ that anyone can be saved. Physical death, the basic message of my book, physical death does not mark the end of when God works in people's hearts. He continues into the ages to come. Does the book teach that repentance and faith are unnecessary? No. All will eventually be saved because all will eventually repent and believe. Does the book teach that everyone God created will eventually be in heaven? Yes. Evil will not remain a part of God's creation forever. At the end of time, all those that God created will enjoy the peace and joy of being in his presence. The basic message of my book is that God's love is unconditional, his power is irresistible, and he never gives up. God's love is unconditional, his power is irresistible, and he never gives up. How much are you worth? I used to ask that to my kids when they were little kids. I'd say, Will, how much are you worth? He'd look up at me and he'd say, I'm priceless. I'd ask my daughter, Ann, how much are you worth? She'd look up at me and she'd say, I'm priceless. I taught my children that they were priceless. That's how valuable, how much my children are worth. That's how much you are worth. And that's how much every single person God has allowed to be created is worth to him. You and they are priceless. And